My son called my workshop a useless shed 3 days before I planned to leave it to him in my will. He said it while standing beside a black walnut dining table I'd spent 4 months building by hand after my wife died. Didn't even really look at the table first. That part stayed with me. Not the insult itself. The fact that he never actually saw what was in front of him. The workshop sat behind my house near the tree line. Red oak siding. Stone foundation. Tall western windows that caught the evening light through the pines. I built most of it myself in 1998 after Linda got tired of finding sawdust in the kitchen cabinets and wood clamps on the dining room chairs. For 26 years, that building had been the center of my life. Not just work. Memory. Every shelf inside it carried some version of my hands on it. The workbench. The cabinets. The tool wall. The old radio near the planer that still only picked up one station clearly. And after Linda died 2 years ago, the workshop became the only place where silence didn't feel hostile. I could walk in there at 6 in the morning, smell cedar dust and machine oil and fresh-cut walnut, and for a few hours my brain stopped replaying hospital sounds. That matters more than people think. Caleb arrived that Saturday around noon in a black Tesla that rolled too quietly down the gravel driveway. Vanessa stayed in the passenger seat scrolling through her phone for almost a full minute before getting out. Rain clouds hung low over the property. The whole yard smelled like wet dirt and cut wood. "Dad," Caleb said, giving me a quick one-arm hug while checking his phone screen with the other hand. Same expensive watch. Same distracted energy. Same feeling that half his attention always lived somewhere else now. I stepped aside and let them into the workshop. The lights were already on. Warm yellow light across walnut boards stacked near the back wall. Hand tools hanging in careful rows. The dining table standing near the center of the room beneath a canvas cover. I pulled the cover away slowly. Black walnut. Hand-cut joinery. 8 chairs. Linda had sketched the original design years earlier on the back of a grocery receipt. I still kept that receipt folded inside my toolbox drawer. Caleb walked around the table once. Ran 2 fingers lightly across the edge. Then looked past it toward the workshop windows. "You know," he said casually, "if you ever sell this place, somebody could probably tear all this down and build a really nice guest house back here." I laughed quietly at first because I honestly thought he was joking. He wasn't. I looked at him for a long moment. Then asked. "Tear what down?" He gestured around the workshop without even turning fully toward it. "All this." Just like that. 26 years of my life reduced to all this. Vanessa finally walked in carrying coffee from town. She looked around once and smiled politely in the way people do when they're trying to compliment something they secretly don't understand. "It definitely has character," she said. Character. Interesting word. Because people usually use it right before explaining why they think something should be replaced. Caleb set his coffee on my workbench and walked deeper into the shop while Vanessa stayed near the doorway. I watched him glance around the room the same way people look at storage units before deciding what should be kept and what should be thrown away. Not curiosity. Evaluation. That feeling settled heavily in my stomach. The rain started tapping softly against the workshop windows. For a few seconds nobody spoke. Then Caleb pointed toward the old clamp rack near the wall. "You still have all this stuff from when I was a kid." Stuff. Interesting word. Because that stuff included the first-hand plane I ever taught him to use when he was 11 years old. The small oak mallet we made together one summer after he split the first one trying to hit nails with it. The stool near the lathe still had burn marks from the model rocket engine he accidentally dropped in here when he was 13. I remembered all of it instantly. He remembered. Stuff. Vanessa walked toward the dining table and touched the surface carefully with 2 fingers. I mean, she said slowly, the craftsmanship is impressive. Craftsmanship. Another careful word. The kind people use when they respect the effort more than the result. Caleb nodded toward the table. How long did this one take? About 4 months. His eyebrows lifted slightly. Seriously? I nodded. The joinery's all hand-cut. He looked genuinely surprised by that for maybe half a second. Then his phone buzzed. And just like that, the moment disappeared. He checked the screen immediately. Sorry, he muttered, typing something quickly. I stood there watching my son text someone while rain hit the windows behind him and the workshop smelled like walnut dust and stain oil and 30 years of my life. Then Caleb looked up again. You know what the problem is with places like this now? Places like this. Not your workshop. Not Mom's workshop. Places like this. Before I could answer, he continued. They don't really fit how people live anymore. That one landed harder than the first comment. Because now I finally understood something important. Caleb wasn't insulting the workshop. Not intentionally. He genuinely believed he was being practical. That somehow made it worse. Vanessa nodded slightly beside him. Everything's moving toward cleaner spaces now. Multi-use layouts. Open concepts. Smart integration. Smart integration. I looked around slowly at the wooden cabinets I'd built with my own hands. At the tool wall organized exactly the same way for 15 years. At Linda's old gardening hat still hanging near the back door where she left it one afternoon and never came back to retrieve it. Then I looked at my son. What exactly do you think this place is? I asked quietly. Caleb shrugged once. A workshop. No hesitation. No deeper thought. Just a workshop. And standing there under warm yellow lights in the building that had carried me through grief, marriage, fatherhood, and loss, I realized my son had spent his entire adult life seeing the most important place in my world as extra square footage. Vanessa wandered toward the back wall while Caleb checked his phone again. 3 times in less than 10 minutes. I noticed because Linda used to complain about the exact same thing during family dinners. Your son talks to people who aren't in the room more than the ones who are, she once told me quietly after he left Thanksgiving early to take a conference call. At the time, I defended him. Funny how fathers do that. We translate distance into ambition because admitting emotional absence hurts more. Vanessa stopped near the old drafting table beneath the windows. Linda used to sit there on Saturday morning sketching garden layouts while I worked nearby. I still hadn't moved the coffee stain shaped like a half moon near the corner. Vanessa ran her hand lightly across the surface. You could honestly make this space beautiful, she said. Beautiful. Interesting shift. Because now the workshop wasn't useless anymore. Now it was potential. Caleb looked up from his phone. Actually, we were talking about something like that on the drive here. Something inside me tightened quietly after he said that. Not anger. Preparation. The kind your body gives you right before hearing something you already know you won't like. Caleb slipped his phone into his pocket and leaned casually against my workbench. So Vanessa had this idea. Of course she did. If you ever decide to downsize, this part of the property could become a really incredible guesthouse setup. Guesthouse. Not workshop. Not studio. Not dad's space. Guesthouse. Vanessa smiled slightly, warming to the subject now. With glass doors here, she said, gesturing toward the west wall, and maybe polished concrete floors instead of the wood. I stopped hearing parts of the sentence after that. Not because she was being cruel. Because she was redesigning my life out loud while standing inside it. Caleb walked toward the windows. You'd honestly increase the property value a lot. There it was. Finally. The real language. Value. I looked down at the walnut dining table between us. 4 months of work. Hundreds of hours. Every chair balanced by hand because Linda hated uneven furniture. And all Caleb could see was resale potential. Rain rolled harder against the windows now. The old workshop creaked softly around us the way old buildings do during storms. Then Caleb said the sentence that finally changed something permanently inside me. "You know what the crazy part is?" He laughed lightly. "Most people our age would kill for land this close to Raleigh. You're basically sitting on a gold mine back here." Gold mine. Not memory. Not craftsmanship. Not legacy. A gold mine. I nodded slowly after that. Very slowly. Because suddenly I understood something I should have realized years earlier. My son didn't see the workshop as something built. He saw it as something not yet converted into money. Nobody spoke for several seconds after that. Rain rolled steadily across the workshop roof. The old building creaked softly with the weather the same way it always had during storms. I used to love that sound. Linda said the workshop sounded alive when it rained. Caleb stood near the windows scrolling through something on his phone while Vanessa slowly walked around the room studying the walls. Not admiring them. Assessing them. That difference matters. People look at meaningful places differently than they look at investment opportunities. "You know what would actually work here?" Vanessa asked suddenly. I already knew I wasn't going to like the sentence before she finished it. A detached guest suite with floor-to-ceiling glass. Glass. Steel. Concrete. Minimalist. I could practically hear the Pinterest board forming in her head. Caleb nodded immediately. "You'd increase the property value like crazy." There it was again. Value. Not craftsmanship. Not memory. Not history. Value. I looked around the workshop slowly. At the cabinets I built from reclaimed maple 20 years ago. At the tool wall organized exactly the same way since Caleb was in middle school. At the faded pencil marks near the back door where Linda used to measure his height every birthday before he decided he was too old for it. Neither of them had even noticed those marks. That hurt more than I expected. The storm outside darkened the workshop windows until the warm yellow overhead lights reflected softly across the glass. For a second, I caught my own reflection standing between my son and the walnut dining table Linda designed before cancer hollowed her down to 92 pounds. Caleb finally slipped his phone into his pocket. "You've got to think practically now, Dad." Practically. Interesting word. Because people usually use it when emotion becomes inconvenient to whatever they want next. I walked slowly toward the dining table and rested one hand against the edge. 4 months of work. Hand-cut joinery. Every chair balanced individually because Linda hated uneven furniture. Caleb glanced at the table once more. Then casually said, "You can't keep building furniture forever." Silence. Real silence this time. The kind that changes the emotional temperature inside a room permanently. Because suddenly I understood something I should have realized years earlier. My son wasn't imagining a future where he continued my work. He was imagining a future where all of this became available the moment I stopped being useful enough to maintain it myself. Vanessa stepped closer to the windows again. "You could honestly make a fortune selling this property right now." I nodded slowly after that. Very slowly. Then I asked the question that finally made both of them stop moving. "If I died next month?" I looked around the workshop. "How long do you think this building would still exist?" Neither Caleb nor Vanessa answered my question. That told me enough. Rain hammered harder against the roof now. Somewhere outside, thunder rolled across the trees behind the property. Caleb shifted his weight slightly and forced a small laugh. "Dad, come on. Nobody's talking about you dying. No. They were talking about after. That's different. I kept my hand resting on the walnut table. The wood still held a faint warmth from the overhead lights. I asked how long the workshop would survive, I said calmly. Vanessa looked uncomfortable for the first time all afternoon. Not guilty. Just trapped inside a conversation she suddenly realized had become honest. Caleb rubbed the back of his neck. I mean, eventually things have to change. Eventually. Interesting word. Because people often use it when they want something now but don't want to sound cruel asking for it. I nodded once. Then walked toward the old tool wall near the back of the shop. The rain outside mixed with the smell of cedar dust and machine oil and wet earth drifting through the small crack beneath the side door. This planer, I said quietly, resting my hand against the machine, paid for your first year of college. Caleb said nothing. I pointed toward the clamp rack. That cabinet order over there covered your mother's surgery deductible in 2009. Then toward the drafting table beneath the windows. Your mom designed half this workshop sitting right there. Vanessa lowered her eyes after that. Not because she suddenly understood. Because emotional history makes practical conversations harder. Caleb exhaled slowly. Dad, nobody's saying your work doesn't matter. But he said it carefully now. Like someone walking across ice they no longer trusted. I looked around the workshop one more time. At 26 years of sawdust settled into cracks in the floorboards. At hand tools polished smooth by repetition. At the dining table Linda never got to see finished. Then I looked directly at my son. You know what the strange part is? I asked quietly. What? I was planning to leave all of this to you. Silence. Not polite silence. Shock. Real shock. Vanessa looked at Caleb immediately. And for the first time since arriving, neither of them seemed relaxed anymore. The workshop, I continued. The client list. The equipment. The land behind the property. Everything. Caleb stared at me. You were? I nodded once. That was the plan. The storm outside cracked loudly enough to shake the windows. Nobody moved. Because suddenly the conversation wasn't theoretical anymore. Now they understood something dangerous. The useless shed they'd been redesigning out loud was attached to an inheritance they thought would always be waiting for them. Caleb sat down slowly on the stool near my workbench after that. Not casually. Carefully. Like the room itself had changed shape underneath him. Vanessa still stood near the windows holding her coffee with both hands now, no longer talking about goosehouses or property value. The storm outside pressed heavy rain against the glass. Inside the workshop, nobody spoke for several seconds. Then Caleb finally asked. Why didn't you ever tell me? Good question. I thought about it honestly before answering. Because the truth was complicated. I guess I thought you already understood what this place was. That landed harder than I expected. Caleb looked around the workshop differently after that. Actually looked. At the tool wall. At the old drafting table. At the worn floorboards near the table saw. For the first time all afternoon, his attention stopped moving. I walked over to the cabinet beside the workbench and opened the bottom drawer. Inside were dozens of old folders. Client sketches. Wood samples. Receipts. Handwritten measurements. And underneath them, a folded piece of yellow paper. I handed it to Caleb carefully. He unfolded it slowly. Then stared at it without speaking. Linda's grocery receipt. The original sketch for the walnut dining table. Tiny handwritten notes along the edges. Chair dimensions. Wood type. A small heart she drew beside the center leaf extension. Vanessa stepped closer quietly to look over his shoulder. "That's Mom's handwriting," Caleb said softly. I nodded once. She designed it the year before she got sick. Nobody spoke after that. Rain hammered the roof above us. The old workshop lights hummed softly overhead. Then Caleb looked back at the table again. Really looked this time. At the grain. The joinery. The shape. And I watched something uncomfortable happen inside him. Recognition. Not complete. Not magical. But enough. Enough to finally understand that the table wasn't furniture. It was time. Months of it. Years of it. Marriage inside wood grain. Vanessa touched the edge of the receipt carefully. "I didn't know," she said quietly. No. They didn't. That was the whole problem. Because somewhere over the years, Caleb had learned how to measure value almost exclusively in numbers. Property values. Market growth. Square footage. Investment potential. Meanwhile, the most important things in his life had been built by hand in rooms he stopped paying attention to years ago. Caleb folded the receipt slowly and handed it back to me. Then, very quietly, he asked the question I think had finally started frightening him. "Are you changing the will?" I didn't answer Caleb immediately. The storm outside had started easing slightly. Rain still slid down the workshop windows, but softer now. Steadier. I took Linda's receipt from his hand and folded it carefully along the original crease lines before placing it back inside the drawer. Then I closed the cabinet. The sound seemed louder than it should have. Caleb watched me the entire time. Not defensive anymore. Worried. That was new. Finally I looked at him. "I don't know yet." And strangely, that uncertainty hit him harder than anger would have. Vanessa sat down quietly near the workbench for the first time since arriving. No more guesthouse ideas. No more resale discussions. Just silence. Real silence. The kind that settles over people after they realize they accidentally walked into the center of someone else's grief without recognizing it. Caleb rubbed both hands over his face slowly. "When Mom died," he started, then stopped. I waited. She never talked to me about any of this. Any of this. Interesting phrase. Because suddenly I realized something painful. Linda had assumed Caleb already understood. And I had assumed the same thing. That's the danger of quiet love. You think people can see it clearly simply because you've lived inside it for so long. But love unspoken long enough eventually becomes invisible. I walked toward the old drafting table beneath the windows. Linda's gardening books still sat on the bottom shelf exactly where she left them. One still had a dried flower pressed between the pages. "Your mother loved this workshop," I said quietly. Caleb nodded once. "I know." "No," I said calmly. "You remember that she loved it. That's different." That landed. I could see it immediately in his face. Because memory and understanding are not the same thing. Outside, thunder rolled farther away now. The storm was moving on. Caleb looked around the workshop again. At the cabinets. The tools. The old radio. The walnut table. Then finally asked. "Were you really going to leave all this to me?" I nodded once. "The property too?" Silence again. Vanessa looked down into her coffee cup after that. And for the first time all afternoon, neither of them seemed interested in talking about resale value anymore. Caleb leaned back slowly on the stool. Then quietly said something I don't think he meant to say out loud. "I thought you'd eventually sell everything yourself." There it was. The truth. Not cruelty. Distance. Somewhere over the years, my son had unconsciously started imagining my life as something already winding down while he was still accelerating into his own. And standing there inside the workshop Linda helped design, I suddenly realized we hadn't actually been losing the building. We'd been losing the language to understand each other inside it. The question stayed in the workshop long after Caleb stopped speaking. Not the words themselves. The realization underneath them. Outside, the storm had almost passed. Rainwater slid steadily from the gutters while late afternoon light slowly pushed through the trees beyond the workshop windows. I walked toward the old radio near the clamp rack and turned the volume lower until the music dissolved into soft static. Then silence. Real silence. The kind that finally forces people to sit with what they've actually said. Caleb leaned forward on the stool staring at the floorboards. Vanessa still held her coffee, untouched now for nearly half an hour. Neither of them seemed sure what kind of conversation this had become anymore. I looked around the workshop slowly. At the shelves. The hand planes. The cabinet Linda painted herself because she hated the original stain color. Then I said something I hadn't planned on saying out loud. The appointment with the estate attorney was Monday. Both of them looked up immediately. Caleb frowned. What appointment? I was transferring the workshop into your name. Silence. Not polite silence. Shock. I kept my voice calm. The property behind the house too. The client accounts. Most of the equipment. Vanessa slowly lowered her coffee cup onto the workbench. Because suddenly this afternoon wasn't theoretical anymore. Now there was a version of reality sitting directly in front of them where everything they had casually discussed tearing down had almost belonged to them permanently. And they hadn't even recognized its value while standing inside it. Caleb swallowed hard. You already had everything prepared? Almost. Nobody moved after that. Rain tapped softly against the windows while the workshop lights hummed overhead. Finally Vanessa spoke quietly. Thomas, we didn't know. No. They didn't. That was the tragedy of it. Not greed. Distance. I walked over to the walnut table and rested my hand lightly against the surface. The wood felt cool now beneath my palm. Your mother used to say craftsmanship only matters to people willing to slow down long enough to notice it. Caleb stared at the table for several seconds without speaking. Then quietly said. I think I stopped seeing this place as part of you. That landed harder than any apology could have. Because it was honest. Not polished. Not defensive. Not careful. Just true. I nodded once. That was probably the most honest thing my son had said to me in years. Outside, the storm finally cleared completely. Warm evening light moved slowly across the walnut table Linda designed years earlier on the back of a grocery receipt folded inside my toolbox drawer. Nobody talked about ghosthouses anymore. Or resale value. Or tearing anything down. We just stood there together in the smell of cedar dust and rainwater while the workshop settled quietly around us. And for the first time since Linda died, it no longer felt like I was standing inside that room alone. Thank you for listening. Calm justice doesn't shout. It keeps records.